This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive."
Well, good morning, everyone. So, this past week, actually on the 20th, my parents had their 50th wedding anniversary. It blows me away. If Jen and I make it to 50 years, we'll be in our 80s. But it's just unbelievable. And so we talked to them. We've got a trip planned to celebrate it and all these things. But it's just really neat that a marriage can last that long. And Jen and I both come from excellent examples before us. But as we were discussing all this, I also realized something else. I started seeing little things on my Facebook about how also on that same day, the movie Jaws turned 50 years old. Did you know that? Suddenly the wheels started turning, and I realized my parents got married on the day the movie Jaws came out. And there are a number of jokes just bubbling under the surface, trying to come up with one, but here's a couple. "Hey Dad, you got married on the same day the movie Jaws came out. Which one was the bigger horror movie?" "Did Steven Spielberg direct your marriage too?" I don't know. I thought it was funny, and I have yet to call them and give them a hard time about that. 50 years, though. It's amazing, right? We have been in a series, we've been talking about The Story, which is a 31-week series where we are going through the story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And we are trying to, from this overview, get an idea of the story of how God lost humanity and brought them back. We're trying to put it in a way that we could all eventually retell the story and make some sense out of history itself, how God created people succumbed to sin. He lost people in that sense. And then he set about to overcome sin and bring people back to him. That story is what informs our lives. That story is what allows us to know how our story fits into it and gives us purpose and meaning and reason to live our lives. Last week, we talked about the guy that took charge after Moses dies. Anyone remember his name? Joshua. Joshua was the guy that took charge after Moses died. And he was the one that actually properly took them into the promised land. And so his story largely included a lot of battles, including the one where the sun stayed in the sky for a whole day. but it was a series of battles as they drove people out and took claims of the promised land itself. And today is a little bit different because at this point, Joshua, this new leader, has died. And they have essentially taken the promised land. And they took the land and they divided it up amongst the 12 tribes. And they said, okay, Judah, you're going to go here, and Ephraim, you're going to go over here, and Zebulun and Issachar, you're going to come up here, and so on and so forth. And they divvy up the land, and everything is kind of there. One of the things we find out at the end of Joshua and the beginning of our next book is that there are still some pockets of enemies remaining. And what we have at this point is not really truly the nation of Israel as we think of it in the time of King David or Solomon. What we have is, it's more like the 13 colonies than it is the United States. Because it's 12 colonies, it's 12 tribes, and they're all living together, sort of loosely associated. And there's not really a king that's over all of it, but there are little leaders, provincial leaders that rise up and do things. And they're kind of independent at times, but kind of not, as different enemies come and take over. And so I want to switch your mindset from, the United States in its early days to really the colonial times, loosely connected with a not quite so formal government keeping over them. And this is what we call the period of the Judges. And I will go ahead and warn you that the Judges it's a dark book. It just is. There's a lot of difficult things in this book. And if you read it, you might even be shocked by some of the things that you read. But one of the ways to say this is to also remind you of the very last verse of the book of Judges. Judges, this in-between period that gets us from, okay, we've conquered the land to we've become this true nation. Judges, with the informal government. The book ends with a summary of its contents before it. This is, chapter 21, verse 25. The very last book of the verse tells you something. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Now, when this book says this, and by the way, it's also said earlier in chapter 17, it essentially bookends the last section of the book. And this phrase, there was no king, everyone did as they saw fit, was a way of sort of summarizing the contents before them, that they're not pretty. Because in a world with no moral authority to set over them and say, this is what's right and this is what's wrong, when everyone does as they see fit, there's often a lot of disagreement about what's right and wrong. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but sometimes we as humans don't have the same idea of what's right and what's wrong. And when you live in a world without that kind of authority and that kind of commitment to living out the law, when you don't have a king keeping people focused around the one true king in heaven, you end up with a rather dark book with a lot of nasty and cruel and violent things happening. And so it reminds us, in those days there was no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. In fact, some translations say everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest, is it possible that we also live in a world where everyone tends to do what they think is right in their own eyes? In a world in which there's no singular authority that spells out what is okay and not okay. Do we live in a world in which we all ram into each other with our different ideas of what's right and what's wrong, and in the end, everyone does what they think, and society itself ends up chaotic as a result? Does any of that sound familiar to you? Because we live in a world in which there's a lot of issues like this. For instance, we tell each other that everything is relative. Right and wrong depends on the circumstances. That there is no absolute, because there's no absolute truth. It depends on your perspective. It depends on where you're coming from. And as long as there are no absolutes, there are no absolute right and wrong. If there's no absolute right and wrong, then everyone has the ability to do what they think is right in their own eyes. It's hard. We also say, okay, well, let's get together and let's talk about what's right and wrong. But the problem is you and I are talking about totally different things. Because I look back at the Bible and I say, this is my authority. And I believe that God brought this into the world for us to study it and look at it. Not so much as just a rule book, but as a story that orients our lives. And in it is contained an incredible amount of wisdom. And my idea of right and wrong depends on how I understand this book. And then you say, well, that book is irrelevant to me. So on what basis do we argue right and wrong? There's no basis underneath of it for any morals at all. And instead, we end up in a society where he who is loudest wins. And if I yell louder than you yell, then I must be right. We end up in a world that is morally chaotic. And the question is, in a world in which there is no king and everyone does what they think is right in their own eyes, how do we be faithful anyway? That is at least part of the book of Judges. Well, let's go a little bit further. There's some other things we need to know about Judges. In the book of Judges, there's a very easy, recognizable pattern. And this pattern, what they sometimes call a cycle, is very distinct. In fact, the book takes the time in chapter 2 to basically spell out the entire pattern that you will see for the rest of the book. It's really remarkable. I've got a little chart I'm going to use to try to explain this. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Let me read the passage first, and then we'll do the chart. Let's go to Judges chapter 2, and let's pick up in verse 6. Okay. See if you can start to recognize kind of how this comes out. There's a pattern. Verse 6. Okay, so if we end with Joshua. Joshua is the one who led them into the promised land. And it says, after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they conquered everything. They went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance, all the tribes divided. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and all who had seen the great things the Lord had done for Israel. So, step one in this cycle is that people are doing right. Joshua lived for God. The people followed his example, and they saw the things that God did as a result, and so they're living faithfully for God. When it tells you that they served the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime, what does it imply about after Joshua's lifetime? Things changed. So let's look at the generation after that. We're jumping down to, I believe, verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Baal is an idol, a false god. So what happens? You have people who remember what God did, and then another generation grows up and they don't remember. They didn't see it with their own eyes, and they become more lackadaisical about their commitment. And then, in time, they fall away from God, and they start doing the things they shouldn't do, including worshiping other gods. Does any of this sound plausible to human nature? The one group loves God, and then another comes up and forgets what the others before them went through and learned. Jump down to verse 14. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them over to the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Because they rejected God, God eventually led them so that these pockets of enemies would rise up and cause them trouble. Verse 15, whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. So in other words, step one, they're doing right. Step two, they forget about God. They fall into sin. Step three, God allows them to be taken over by enemies. And so these things are not going well. And it's a problem. I believe now I was going to go ahead and show you the cycle here. Here's what we're going to see throughout the remainder of the book. Step one, at the top there, people are faithful. Step two, going clockwise. Okay. I turn around and see it on both screens. They forget and commit idolatry. Step three, they're attacked by their enemies. But here's where it gets interesting. Because after they're attacked, suddenly they're humbled. Suddenly they cry out to God, as one does sometimes when things aren't going well in life. And they cry out to God, and God hears them. And when that happened, God ends up sending them someone to rescue them. And these are the people we call the judges. Let's read the next couple verses here. Verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. And let's go a little bit further, verse 18. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of the groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted him. The book is spelling out for us at the very beginning everything we're going to see over and over again. So God raises up a judge, and then they become faithful and follow God again, until they don't. Verse 19, but when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So go back to our picture. They're faithful, they forget, they get overrun by enemies. God saves them with a judge. They cry out to God. God saves them. They're faithful for a little while, and then what happens? They forget again. So tell me this. Have you ever repeated a mistake in your life? Have you ever said, I'm going to do differently this time, only to find out that this time is just like every other time? It's something about our human nature that we set out to be better and do better, and yet we make mistakes. We fall back. And sometimes what's amazing is that God continues to allow us to make those mistakes. He gives us second chances, and we get to cycle through there a few times. But I will say, if you are reading through this book, it only gets darker, okay? He gives them second chance after fifth chance after whatever. But eventually they need to break out of the cycle. And they never really quite do. And that's why the book of Judges overall is a fairly sad book. It's not my favorite. But it's an interesting book, and we need to read it to understand, because this is human nature, and this is us. Sometimes you only want to cry out to God when things are going badly. And we end up in these cycles instead of living a consistent life in faithfulness to God. So let's talk about these judges. Real quick. Judges, as we've kind of implied here, does not mean you need to picture a courtroom, okay? These are not judges in robes deciding cases. Now, to be fair, that probably happens some, especially in the case of Deborah. We see that, and even kings like Solomon would decide cases at times for the people. But primarily, these judges are simply the leaders of the people in a smaller provincial sense, more so than king. And with that, they are often warriors. They're often those who took on the enemies that have been bothering them, attacking their fields, and these things. And so many times they are kind of warrior king types. So judge, don't picture Judge Judy, okay? Picture a warrior king that God raises up in a moment to lead Israel and rescue them from others. Okay, with that in mind, the rest of the book is a list of the lives of 12 different judges. And we do not have time to cover all 12, I'm sorry. In fact, your book, if you're reading the book, the story, if you don't have one and you want one, we still got a few there in the lobby. It covers 3. It primarily focuses on Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. After a lot of thought and going into this, I'm only going to do 2 this morning. I really, really wanted to tell you all about Samson, but there's no way I can do that story justice and be out of here before 12:30, okay? So we're going to focus on Deborah and Gideon. And I'll give you a little bit of summary of the rest of the book, but to give you 2 examples of this cycle, let's do Deborah and Gideon. Everyone okay with that? Okay. Let's get into Deborah. Deborah is an interesting story. Deborah herself is talked about as a prophetess. And prophetesses, by the way, appear regularly throughout the Bible. Women who act in the role of prophet do appear several times, including in the New Testament. And Deborah, operating as a prophetess, it's also said that she would sit near a tree and decide cases. So clearly she does have some authority, some leadership, some ability to judge right and wrong, and she is listed as the leader of Israel. And for all that I can tell, she is very likable. I don't have much bad to say about her. Now, if I were to tell you the story of Samson, I've got a lot of bad to say about Samson. But Deborah is very likable. So we get to Deborah, and we're in Judges chapter 4 now. And in Judges chapter 4, it introduces us to her this way. It says, "Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time." Surprise, surprise. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. You know that tree, right? Okay, sorry. I have a weird sense of humor sometimes, so just bear with me, okay? And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. And so we see that she's a prophet. We see that she decides disputes and that she is the leader of Israel right now. Now, as we tell the story, there's a few characters that get confusing. So I made a little chart here just to help you kind of catch along. Can we go to the next slide here? There we are. Okay. There's 2 sides. The enemy right now is simply listed as Canaan. That's kind of the generic word for enemies in that region. But it's the Canaanite Empire. And Israel on one side versus the Canaanites. The leader of Israel is Deborah, and her counterpart in Canaan is a guy by the name of Jabin. He is the king at that time. But there are 2 other characters that matter, and they are the leaders of the respective armies. Not exactly the same as the king, but important in their roles. For Israel, it's a guy named Barak. Barak is the leader of the military under Deborah. In Canaan, it's a guy named Sisera. Sisera is the leader of the army for Canaan. So on one side, Deborah and Barak, on the other, Jabin and Sisera. Got the names? You'll never forget them, right? Okay, now let's get into the story. So, in verse 6, it says, she sent for, that is Deborah, sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh and Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor." Let's keep going a little bit. "I will lead Sisera." Who's Sisera? The commander of the enemy army. "I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops," he's powerful, "to the Kishon River and give him into your hands." So just to give you the summary here, Deborah tells the commander of her army to go out because it is God's time that he will lead the commander of the other army to this place and they will have it out. In other words, raise up this army. The time is now. Let's push off these bad guys that are causing Israel to suffer. That's the idea. Verse 8, Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." That is a fascinating statement, isn't it? yeah, sure, I'll go fight these bad guys, but I need you, this woman leading Israel at this time, to come with me, because I don't think I can do it without you. I told you she's kind of likable. And why Barak felt this way, I don't know exactly. I don't know if he felt like God was with Deborah, but not necessarily with him. I don't know if Deborah had a great strategic mind. I don't know what it is, but she has predicted with her prophet abilities what will happen and the fact that the Israelites will win this. So Barak makes this plea, and here's her response. Very interesting. "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah. "But because of the course you are taking," which I assume means asking that I come along, "because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." By the way, if you don't know the rest of the story, your assumption at this point is that because he brought Deborah with him, who's she saying going to get credit for this? Her. I'm sure that's what Barak thought. You're saying that I'm not going to get credit for this victory, but you, Deborah, will get the credit because you were here with me. Sure, fine, whatever. I'll share the glory. It ends up being a surprise, but that's surely what they thought in the moment. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. So they're going to this battle, and they go out, and remember, she's a prophetess. She knows what's going to happen, and it goes exactly as she predicted. The armies meet in battle. God allows Israel to rout their enemies. They're all fleeing and running away, and Sisera, and who's Sisera? You guys have forgotten. It was like 2 slides ago. Come on. The leader of the Canaanite army flees, running away, begging for help. Has to flee on foot, gets off his horse and runs away on foot. It's that bad of a defeat. And Sisera, sorry, I was teasing you about the forgetting thing, okay? Just so you know. Sisera flees on foot, and he's looking for a friendly face, someone that can hide him for a little while till he figures out what he's going to do. He escapes without being killed, and he's looking for someone somewhere to take him in. And he gets to thinking, he remembers that the king, Jabin, has an alliance with a particular guy out there in the country by the name of Heber. And so he decides, I'm going to go to Heber, my buddy, who is in alliance with them, and he'll surely take me in and take care of me. And Heber has a wife there who greets him, and her name is Jael. And I want you to see just how sweet this wife, Jael, really is. Look at how she takes him in. Verse 18, Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. So nice of her. Verse 19, "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him up. Nice, warm milk so that he would sleep well. Verse 20, "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone there?' say, 'No, I'm not here.'" And you can see that she's going out of her way to take him in and be very hospitable. And it's kind of interesting we're spending this much time talking about a woman, given how a woman is going to get credit for this battle. I wonder what's going to happen next. If you haven't read this story, I can tell some of you have read it because I can see the looks on your faces, and some of you have not. Let me read the next verse for you. "But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and by the way, he died." I love the understatements of the Bible, right? Drove a tent peg through his head into the ground, and he died. Like, was that necessary? Like, did we have to put that last part in there? But here we have Jael operating apparently on behalf of Israel with different loyalties, who uses her cunning and her wisdom and her hospitality to now deal the final blow, the one that opens things up for Israel to finally fully drive out their enemies. And she is the one who gets the credit for this. And to be quite honest with you, as gross as this is, if I'm being totally honest with you, this is one of the more pleasant stories in the book of Judges. I hate to admit it, but it is. And a woman gets credit for this, to the surprise of everyone. It wasn't Deborah entirely, but this little-known woman, Jael, who in this moment acts on behalf of God's people. And he uses her, as well as the others, to rescue Israel from their enemies. Second chance. Now this time, let's behave right before God and not forget what he's done. Except that you know as well as I know that it's not going to be that easy. Because we all have cycles of mistakes in life, and so does the nation of Israel. And so let's do our other one. Who was the other judge I said I was going to talk about? You should have not done the slide until they said it, man. Gideon. Gideon is a fascinating story. I really enjoy Gideon. It's an interesting story. Once again, the Israelites have started to disobey God, and it's gotten really bad. The enemy this time are the Midianites from the land of Midian, one of their neighbors. And the Midianites are so cruel that whenever the Israelites grow crops, they are invading the land and just destroying the crops. Now, why would you want to destroy the crops? To make them starve, right? To make it unpleasant for them in this land so they will go away. And this is getting bad. They don't have the food that they need. And so Israel needs to turn to someone. God is going to raise up someone to rescue them. And they choose a rather unlikely person by the name of Gideon. And the opening scene and introduction to him is honestly and intentionally, I think, quite humorous. We don't often think of the Bible as humorous, but if you read this story, it's impossible for me to think that you could read this and not find this funny. And so we are now in Judges chapter 6, if you're trying to follow along. And in Judges chapter 6, we are going to pick up in verse 11. Verse 11, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was, and pay attention to this, threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Okay, here's what you've got to understand. A winepress is for pressing the wine. Make sense? It is not for threshing the wheat. The wheat is usually threshed and divided in the field, but he has taken the wheat and he is putting it under a building, under cover, where no one would expect, and secretly, quietly doing his threshing under cover. Why? Because he's scared. Because the Midianites are going to come and take his wheat from him. So he is literally in hiding in a building, trying not to be seen. And then this angel appears and says, "You are blessed, mighty warrior." And I'm sure that Gideon looked behind him and wondered if he was talking to someone else. Have you ever done that? Someone tries to talk to you and you're like, "You're talking to me?" And this is funny because Gideon is not a warrior here. He is hiding from the enemy. And yet the conversation goes on in a fascinating way. The angel commissions him to be the one to drive out the enemy armies. And he then goes on and he gives all sorts of excuses, kind of like Moses did, where he says, "Well, I'm not a good speaker," and all this or that. Gideon says, "Well, I'm from a very weak tribe, and my family is the least in all of these tribes, and I'm the least in my family. There's no way that I shouldn't be the person to do this. And I imagine him stuttering the entire time he's talking to him. And God reassures him, but Gideon's reputation for doubting and being unsure is quite legendary. Because over and over again, God has to reassure Gideon as the process plays out in which he becomes the warrior that drives everyone out. So, for instance, right here with the angel, if you read the rest of the story, Gideon goes and prepares a sacrifice, and God says, to show you that I am with you so that you believe me, he burns up the sacrifice in a miraculous way right before his very eyes. Wow. That's some reassurance. And then later, and perhaps more famously, Gideon directly asks God for a sign that would assure him that God is on his side. And so this happens with a piece of fleece, a piece of wool. We're going down to chapter 6, verse 36. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place the wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand as you said. And I've got to think, this is kind of testing God, is it not? And yet God doesn't ridicule him. He does what he asks, and he allows the fleece to be wet with dew and the ground to be dry, and he wrings it out, and a bucket full comes out. And then he goes a step further. And he asks God, well, what if the wool were dry and the ground were wet with dew? And then God does that. And I think, Gideon, you really need to stop now. Then we go further in the story, and believe it or not, I'm going to skip over that next passage, so I've got to get moving a little faster. But we go on to the end of the story, and there's this time when they're just about to finally attack the Midianites, and God says, if you need one more reassurance, I'll tell you what to do. And he says, go down to the camp and just walk around and listen to them talking, and you will be reassured. You know, obviously he's got to kind of covertly go into the enemy camp. So he hides and gets into the enemy camp, and he overhears them talking. One of them is talking about a dream he had the night before that essentially demonstrated that Israel was absolutely going to destroy them in this battle. And they were completely afraid. That is the final thing that gives him reassurances. And the last and most interesting thing is that God really, really wanted to make sure that everyone understood that the reason they win this battle was not because of Gideon, but because of him. He actually makes Gideon get rid of most of his soldiers. He lets him only stay with 300 soldiers, only 300. And he makes the war happen in a wildly unusual way. You know, in Jericho, how they marched around the city and the walls fell? It's almost that ridiculous. We're now in chapter 7, verse 19. Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle of the watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. That was their attack call. They blow trumpets and break jars. And you can imagine 300 men blowing trumpets and breaking jars. Actually, it's only 100 at this point. The other 200 were hiding elsewhere. Anyway, and it causes chaos. Verse 20. The three companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And while each man held his position around the camps, all the Midianites did what? Ran, crying out as they fled. We're being attacked in the middle of the night. There's all this noise happening. What is going on? Verse 22. Then when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Maholah near Tabith. Long story short, they began killing each other, which implies that They didn't have this wonderful battle strategy. God literally allowed them to win by making the enemy so afraid they attacked themselves. You want to know who got the credit for this one? God did, and he wanted it. So, long story short, the book of Judges is about this cycle of mistakes, of Israel messing up. And over again, God continues to give them more chances. And there are minor lessons we can pick up along the way, like Deborah's wisdom, Gideon's courage, eventually. We can talk about God's power and how it's evident throughout this book as he continues to drive enemies away from them. But in the end, you need to know that this is not a happy book. Remember our last verse? What was it? In those days, there was no, what? King. Everyone did as they saw fit. And if you were to go on and read the final section of the book, chapter 17 through 21, you would be absolutely appalled, honestly. It is really the account of the first civil war in Israel, as the tribes turn and attack each other. It's a very, very sad account. And what I want you to know is that yes, there's all these ideas we can take with us about God's power and Gideon developing the courage and Deborah having the wisdom and so on and so forth. But ultimately, I think this is about understanding that we have to learn from our mistakes. We have to change the cycle. We have to break the pattern. When we don't learn from our mistakes, things fall apart. Our life goes in cycles. Our spiritual life goes from moving toward God to falling away, to moving back to him to falling away. And over again, life just gets harder and more complicated. And yes, all of us will make mistakes in our life. We will make mistakes spiritually. But if we can't pause and reflect on them and learn from them, then we will only repeat these patterns again and again and again. And I encourage you that whatever is going on in your life, to take the time to pause and reflect on the mistakes that you've made. What can you learn from them? Why have you gone through this season? What does God want you to take out of this? Because none of us want to repeat the battle forever. We all want to say that we're a little bit wiser with our experience, but to do that, you've got to reflect on it. And you've got to break the cycle. And you've got to move wholly and fully toward the God of the universe. That is something that I'm not sure Israel ever did, at least in this book. But maybe later on we'll find a glimpse of that. Our application steps are pretty much what I just said. Ask God what you need to learn from your past mistakes. And then, as you have some time this week, read chapter 9 of the story. I believe we're going into the book of Ruth, which is an interesting, fascinating little book. And I think we'll have a lot of fun looking into it next week. If you will, let's bow our heads. God in heaven, I thank you for loving us as you do. I ask that you'll be with us this day and this moment. And I pray, Lord, that we can remember to look back on our past mistakes and reflect on them and find out, Lord, what it is we're supposed to take from that. What can we learn? And how can we stop this cycle from happening again? Lord, we know that some of these stories in the Bible are kind of ugly. But we also know that in them, your grace is so amazing that you are able to redeem these things, and you never let go of your people. You simply wait for them to finally look to you, and you come running. Lord, I know that you did that with your people in Israel, and I know that you have done it with me, and I know that you do it with believers all over the world. And so this very day, we ask you for your grace. Where we have made mistakes, forgive us. Pull us back into your arms, and teach us to break the patterns of living by this world, and instead live in the joy of you. It's in your Son's precious name we pray. Amen.